Thanks so much. Thanks for coming out on a Monday night. I hope you're earning extra credit. And if not, if you have your computer, you can at least shop for sandals while I talk. So, I'm really grateful to be here. I'm so thankful to Sandy, especially, and all those who made it possible, including the art department. Thanks for co-sponsoring this. I'd like to begin with a word about the title and the advertised description of the talk. First, with regard to the title, you can see it here. It's often been said that the best things about my talks are, in fact, the titles. Just let it simmer for a minute. That's as good as the jokes are going to get. If you get used to it, we're going to be moving on good. The best things are frequently the title. Second, I've picked the title carefully, but also, to be honest, somewhat deviously. Kind of general, right? Art and theology, God's body. Trying to get more people to come than might otherwise would show up on a Monday night to talk on the Bible and ancient Near Eastern art. I realize, of course, that I could have gotten more people, perhaps, if I changed the title. Something like Kendrick Lamar, #MeToo, and the Song of Solomon, right? I mean, would that have worked? That might have got a few more people, I suspect. But that would have lacked truth in advertising, and so let me repeat here what the advertisement said, and that I hope I'll be able to deliver on. So let's see, here's the description. Despite the second commandment in the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments about the making of images, religious people, both ancient and modern, have often represented divine bodies in art. This lecture will examine this phenomenon and focuses on a problem presented in ancient artistic representations of divinity, namely, their frequently small size when compared to ancient textual descriptions, which often speak of the gods as giant, if not cosmic in scale. In the end, this disjuncture between text and image suggests that the ancients were capable of differentiating the real divine body from the represented one, with the latter becoming a focus of attention, even contemplation, for the former. Ancient iconography, in the end, is quite closely connected to modern religious iconography. Not exactly as cool as Kendrick Lamar and Song of Songs, but hopefully it can hold our attention for a bit. Now, there's quite a lot going on in the description, and so let me unpack it a bit before delving into the meat of it. So first, most of you here will recall probably the second commandment of the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments, which forbids the making of images. Here's the most pertinent part of that commandment in the Common English Bible's rendering. Do not make an idol for yourself, no form whatsoever of anything in the sky above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow down to them or worship them. Okay? A lot could be said about just this much, just this part of the commandment. But suffice it to say for now that many scholars believe this commandment wasn't just about making images of other gods, but also about making images of God, capital G, the Lord God of Israel. Okay, fine, but as the lecture description indicates, that didn't stop people from making images of God, depicting God's body in art in times past and up to the present. Now, if you were listening really closely, you saw what I did just there. Truth in advertising. I hit all the main topics in the title in one sentence. Thank you. I think I deserve bonus points from the marketing department. Do you have a marketing department here at Westmont? So, anyway, here's more famous proof of the fact that people did depict God's body. Here it is, Michelangelo's famous picture of God from the Sistine Chapel, just one of them. There's God busting in, evidently making the sun and the planets, and there he is, turning on the jets and making a quick getaway. With a certain lack of decorum, one might say, at least by our standards. Exodus wasn't kidding when it reports that Moses really saw God's backside. And Moses ain't the only one, is he? So this brought to mind, I saw this for the first time this summer when I was in Rome in the Sistine Chapel. I had never seen the whole thing, and there's God, and there's the backside of God, right? I mean, what do you know? I mean, not only depicting God, but depicting some maybe inelegant parts, though you got to say God's been working out. So this brought to mind another version, more recent, from the Awkward Moments Children's Bible, Volume 1, which you may have seen, and this is how they depict the Exodus 34 exchange. There it is. Behold my glory. And there's Moses seeing God's backside, as it were. All right. Now, as you can imagine, and have probably seen not only from something like this, there are tons of ancient depictions of various gods and many of them have been recovered from the soil of ancient Israel-Palestine. It's hard to believe that the pieces that have been recovered from the archaeology of ancient Israel-Palestine were all left behind by visitors, just passing through. It would appear, therefore, that at least some of those images, at some of those times, at some points in Israelite history and Israelite and Judean history, people, Israelites and Judeans, to be specific, made, had, and used divine images. Some, perhaps even many of those images were of other gods, and therefore we would call them idolatrous nowadays. But others may well have been images of the Lord God of Israel. Either way, both scenarios would seem to violate the second commandment, but could also explain why the second commandment is necessary in the first place, to guard against this sort of violation. Now, everything I've said so far supports basically the first sentence of my description of the class. Yay, check. Done, right? So now I want to move on to the rest of the description because I'm all about truth and advertising. So, the issue I want to explore with the rest of my time in a bit more detail is how so many of the divine images that are recovered from ancient Israel, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and so forth are very, very small materially, okay? They're in small little objects. This seems somewhat odd because the gods were so big. Not just big as in important, but big as in truly massive, cosmic in scale even, according to textual sources from the ancient world. So, in an earlier iteration, my talk was entitled this, Divine Bodies in Textual and Iconographical Representation, Size and /as Metaphoricity. That's not the title I used tonight, but it isn't bad and it's still useful as it encapsulates the main issues I want to discuss with the time I have left. And in particular, I'm going to come back to the metaphor bit. So off we go, though I should say first that iconography is a term used for the study of images. In Greek, image is icon. I'll be speaking mostly about ancient Near Eastern iconography, the study of images from the ancient world. But iconography is also a term used in Orthodox circles to this day, given the importance of icons in that branch of Christianity. In Orthodoxy, iconography refers to the making and liturgical use of icons, religious images, and an iconographer is one who practices that art. That's contemporary Orthodox Christianity. I'm going to come back and touch on that a bit, Orthodox use of icons, at the very end of my talk. But again, I'm focusing primarily on iconography as the study of ancient Near Eastern art, a field that, conducted with reference to the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, was begun by a scholar named Otmar Kahle, a professor at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. There's a picture of Otmar when he was younger. And that is his breakthrough book in 1972, Die Welt der altorientalische Bildsymbolik, the symbolism of the biblical world, published in English in 1978 and again in 1988, still in print in 6th edition of 1996. So, Otmar Kahle started this. Now, I want to start, therefore, with a vignette that he recounts. In it, he narrates the first time that he encountered a material representation of the Canaanite god Baal. He was, in a word, surprised. There was a major disconnect between his prior conceptions of Baal, especially via stories about this god that are preserved in the Old Testament. And this is an image that Kahle presents himself, an older piece, 1705, that sort of depicts these wicked gods, right? And there they are with a very scary up there at the top particularly. These sorts of images of this big evil god that you get from the Bible, and the rather modest 20 centimeter high figurine, that's 7 inches, just shy of 8. Picture of Baal, a statue from Baal from Ugarit, the ancient city of Ugarit, that he saw in front of him in the museum display case at the Louvre in the summer of 1955. The narratives about Baal, for example, that of Elijah at Mount Carmel, evoke a powerful deity, right? Well, if you know that story, ultimately not so powerful, but nevertheless, evokes a powerful deity, an entity that commanded a number of people's respect and worship. But here in front of Kahle, at 18 years of age, was a rather smallish figure, and even if it was made of precious metal, and well made at that, various aspects of its reality left something to be desired. Size, it would seem, even among late Bronze Age deities, matters. And Kahle felt that problem keenly the first time he laid eyes on harmless little Baal. To put it crassly, Baal in the Bible was big and scary, Baal in the Louvre, not so much. Call him Baby Baal. So, as I've already indicated, I want to investigate further this disjuncture captured in Cale's vignette, namely the disconnect between stories of impressive deities on the one hand and their physical representations that are often far less than that on the other. My initial presumption is that Cale's not alone. I suspect that the disconnect he felt is felt by many others at many different times, maybe in museums now, but also, I think, in antiquity for at least two reasons. Here's the first. The first is the tradition of divine bigness. The largeness of ancient gods is variously manifested, but one way it was manifested was in physical size, or presumed physical size. This tradition is well known and widely attested, especially in the textual record. So first, I'm going to talk in some ways about the way different texts establish the bigness of ancient gods. The second reason why I think this disjuncture also obtained in antiquity is the equally venerable tradition of presenting the gods artistically in very small form. To be sure, the gods could be depicted in massive, monumental, gigantic ways, but the vast majority of surviving art, and arguably the most important type of art in terms of its ability to communicate information widely and effectively and affordably, is miniature in scale. Small, portable objects, especially very small seals. But even outside of seals, much of the divine statuary that survives, especially in precious materials, is very small. So after discussing the textual material, I will discuss the relative smallness of the gods in the artistic record. These two items then, textual divine bigness and artistic divine smallness, along with a third consideration, namely their uneasy and rough juxtaposition, combine to suggest that Cale's surprise may also have held true for ancient people. But the combination of these traditions, while definitely disruptive, need not be interpreted only as a moment of disappointment, especially in antiquity, if for no other reason than that the textual bigness and artistic smallness were both pervasive. This alone suggests that they belong together somehow, even if we have to work a little bit to figure out why. Both traditions, that is, are widely attested and must have been commonly experienced, frequently together or somehow even simultaneously. So, in a third move, I will suggest that the combination of big text size with small artistic images suggests that the depiction of the deity in visual media, especially small deity presentation on small visual media, indicates that such images are not presentation of the gods, but representation of the gods. That is to say, these images are not actually pictures of the gods, of course they aren't, so much as symbols of the gods, loci of attention and veneration, but also loci for reflection, meditation, and devotion. The smallness of artistic representation, especially in the face of textual bigness, suggests that divine size, especially on the small end of the equation, encapsulates a particular and sophisticated way of thinking about the gods and the bodies of the gods. In this way, we catch a glimpse on how the ancients, including, I think, ancient Israelites, thought about their deities. This study of ancient iconography is thus an entree, not only into ancient religion, but also into ancient cognition. How did they think about God? Was God big? Was God small? And how would you know? That's kind of what I'm trying to get after. Make sense so far? All right. First then, divine bigness in text. Numerous texts are clear that the divine bodies are, among other things, super huge. Mark Smith has nicely summarized the data from Ugarit, which is an ancient site on the Mediterranean north of Israel, where Baal was a big deal. And he also summarizes this data from the Old Testament itself. At Ugarit, deities are said to travel 1,000 fields, 10,000 miles, sometimes in a single stride. That's pretty big. And then they bow down in obeisance to each other from impossible distances, which turn out not to be impossible at all because they're so big. In Smith's words, these descriptions evoke deities that are superhuman in size, striding across massive areas of earth. Divine bigness is evoked by other means as well, by describing a particular part of the god's body as large, for example, which part for the whole suggests the rest of the divine form is similarly huge. Or by depicting divine accoutrements, a god's clothing, for instance, or his temple as large, which then suggests mammoth dimensions for the god. In terms of the Hebrew Bible, Smith mentions Isaiah 6. You remember Isaiah 6, where the hem of God's robe fills the entire temple, right? Just the hem of the robe. That means God's robe is pretty big, and that means God's body inside the robe's even bigger, right? Or the details of Solomon's temple, the 10 by 10 by 10 cubit cube that is the Holy of Holies, wherein the deity would take a seat on the ark, or what they call the molten sea, a tank that holds about 38,000 liters. That's a pretty big tank, and that was evidently in part thought to be God's wash basin. These are some images I found on the internet. I'm pretty sure they're totally accurate. The exaggerated size of the structures in the Solomonic temple courtyard therefore suggest, according to Smith, that they were intended not for human use, but for the realm of the divine. If that's accurate, the divine self that uses these huge items must also have been considered to be enormous. Other texts could also be mentioned, like Isaiah 66:1. Here it is. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Those are pretty big feet, y'all. The point about divine bigness seems well established, therefore, and not particularly controversial. A further example of divine size from Ugarit might be mentioned. In one text recovered from that site, Baal is described actually as a mountain. He sits, the text says, like the sitting of a mountain. And the poem goes on to describe parts of his body or its features in terms suitable for Mount Zaphon, which was his holy mountain at the site. His brow is dew-drenched, his head is in the snows in heaven, and his mouth is like two clouds. There's an operative metaphor going on in that poem. It's this: Baal is a mountain. And a key component of that metaphorical message is Baal is large, like really, really big. Mountain big. So this metaphor communicates, among other things, divine size. Similar sentiments are found in other texts from the Old Testament or elsewhere in the ancient Near East. So again, the point's not particularly controversial. All would seem to agree that the gods are, among other things, big, or at least can be big. So we can affirm with Smith that this idea of divine scale may have been quite widespread, though it seems perfectly fine to strike the may and just say it was widespread. Well, at least in texts. I want to now illustrate how the artistic record is more ambiguous on the question of divine size. There are, to be sure, examples of divine bigness in the artistic record. These include monumental reliefs that can sometimes be very impressive indeed. The Behistun relief, for example, is carved 225 feet above the road and measures approximately 50 feet in height and 82 feet long. It's like a really big billboard, ancient Near Eastern billboard. And it's got to be big because it's so far above the road. This makes the picture of King Darius here, and then here's the actual image. That makes him about 10 feet high. And the Persian god Ahura Mazda, peeking out here out of the wings, that makes him not much less than that. Or mention could be made of depictions of Egyptian deities on monumental reliefs, say at Karnak. Here's one at Karnak with the god, though this is actually the king, he's bigger. I'll say something about that in a minute. Or Medinet Habu, here in figure 5. Also the king striking the enemy with the gods approving. So Egypt also had its share of large three-dimensional statuary besides that. Here's an exemplary image. Something that is not found actually frequently in other parts of the ancient Near East. Other parts of the ancient Near East didn't depict gods in statuary this size. So this depiction of the god Hadad, who's related to Baal, from Zingirli is a notable exception. And if you were standing there, this is from the museum in Berlin, most of us would come up to about right there. You can kind of gauge it from the size of the placard here. It would probably be about that. So he's pretty big, Hadad. I mean, a really big outside linebacker, Now, many other pieces of monumental art, while public, are often at best life-size and typically less than that. So here's an example from the Melkart stela. It's the Aramaic piece. The example here is not quite 4 feet tall. That's the god Melkart. And the relief at the top of the stele of Hammurabi, which is the famous law code from Mesopotamia, is only slightly more than 2 feet tall. So quite small here, about 2 feet tall. This is Hammurabi in front of the god Shamash. The biggest problem with these sorts of images, whether extra large, human-sized, or slightly less than that, is that they're mostly the exception, not the rule. Monumental art is difficult and costly to produce, after all, and it wasn't ideal for the communication of information quickly, cheaply, or across wide geographical expanses. It comes as no surprise, then, that most ancient objects of art are small, and especially in the iconographical record of ancient Israel-Palestine, most of these pieces belong to the category of minor art, seals, seal impressions, amulets, and so forth. And here's just some examples. We're talking about very tiny objects, some of them quite a bit smaller than your thumb, okay, to give you an example. There are other ways to portray divine bigness, however, besides monumentality. One would be in architecture. I've already mentioned the textual deities concerning Solomon's temple, but a well-known and particularly intriguing example in the archaeological record is the temple at Indara, which depicts 4 supersized footprints with each approximately 3 feet long. Okay, they're here. They're the 2 footprints, and there's one, and there's one. Okay, and they're at the doorpost. This is like the front step of the house, and then they sort of stride in. Right. Each is about 3 feet long. At the front threshold of the temple, both the left and right feet are next to each other. But as one moves into the temple, the thresholds have only 1 footprint. First the left, then the right, such that the ancient artisans are trying to establish the aniconic presence of a deity standing at the entrance of the temple and then striding into its inner sanctum. And if you do the math with a 3-foot size foot and then the stride of this particular deity, the deity would have been about 65 feet tall. This is a fascinating find, but it remains, at least to my knowledge, altogether unique. Professor Richter might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. So, Indara aside, divine smallness, at least relative to the cosmic scale of the textual tradition, seems to be the order of the day, divine smallness. To underscore the problem, then, of divine scale even further, let me make 2 additional observations. First, even on monumental pieces, it is often the case that when a king is present, he will be depicted as large as or even larger than the god or gods that are also depicted. Here's examples that I showed momentarily with the king, the Persian king on the left, and the Egyptian pharaoh on the right, as big or bigger than the god. And this is not to mention monumental art that is, in terms of scale, predominantly, if not exclusively, royal in focus. So here's a truly monumental image, right? And that is the of the king, not the god. So in this one here, this is the god. Here are the kings, and this is of a pharaoh. You see the size, massive, right? But not of the gods, of the king. So there you go. That's weird. Still further, even if the king is smaller in some portrayals, the disparity is often not a gross one. Exceptions to this judgment seem to be rather few and far between. Here's an example of another piece from Ugarit. This is the god Baal, and this is evidently the king, Nikmadu, and you can see they're quite small compared. But mostly this is exceptional. That's the first point, that mostly, even if the gods are big, the king's bigger. The second point is that this lack of different proportions for divine and human reference also obtains for much smaller objects. An image like this one, figure 15, a seal impression, where you have evidently a goddess, quite large, and a worshiper, quite small. Again, these are these show that the convention was possible, but also they are in the main not adopted or adapted. They just eschewed. They're not really the dominant thing. This piece is from Tel Afis in Syria. The vast majority of divine images, then, especially in ancient Israel-Palestine, are small, whether those are found in small seals or on 3-dimensional statuary. And these small divine figures in the plastic arts are at some odds, or so it would seem, with the big divine images that we find in the text. Now, in all honesty, the textual evidence may also be a bit ambiguous on the notion of divine size, though divine smallness is definitely and appropriately a minority report. So, think, for example, of the text in 1 Kings 19. Right? Everyone know it? You have it in mind? Of course you do. But if not, here it is. There's big things going on in this text. It's when Elijah goes to Mount Horeb, he flees, and he's waiting to have this encounter with God. Lots of big stuff is going on. He's in this cave, right? First, a huge wind comes, so strong that it split the mountains and broke rocks in pieces before the Lord. Then an earthquake happens, and then a fire. But, the text informs us, the Lord God was not in those things. Instead, instead, there comes what Hebrew calls a kol demama daka, whatever that's supposed to be. It's Hebrew, for that's one thing. KJV translates it as, very famously, as a still small voice. Yeah? Wondered where that came from? 1 Kings 19. The NRSV defines it as a sound of sheer silence. The New Jewish Publication Society as a soft murmuring sound. And the latest English translation, the Common English Bible, as a sound, period, thin, period, quiet, period. It is in that sound or voice that Elijah hears another voice, God's. Not in the pyrotechnics, but in this small, small voice. The fact that this theophany is said to take place at Horeb, God's mountain, is quite significant since this is the same mountain where Moses experienced God's gargantuan hand. And God's backside, by the way, to go back to Michelangelo for a minute. But in this particular instance of Horeb 2.0, Elijah, after being overwhelmed by the big ticket items, experienced God instead in the thinnest of things. So in this text, at least, you have a divine smallness. Now, there's a good bit of uncertainty about the proper translation and interpretation, though, of this phrase in Hebrew, kol demama daka. But there are hints of divine smallness elsewhere. There are first anthropomorphic appearances that, while not super small, are apparently to human scale and thus not superhuman. For instance, when Abraham has the 3 visitors come visit him that turn out to be God and 2 angels, and they're basically all the same size. I mean, it doesn't say it exactly that way, but it doesn't say that Abraham was blown away by the tall dudes, okay? Then there are metaphorical presentations where God is likened to things that are on the smaller side of things. Birds, for instance. A particularly interesting text in this regard is Hosea 5:12, where God is likened to a moth, though there is debate over which precise word is used here and whether it refers to a moth, larva, or even, wait for it, pus. That's one of my personal favorite images for God, by the way. Pus. Of the divine sort, of course. Now, if one included the New Testament in the data set, honorable mention might go to seed imagery in various kingdom parables ascribed to Jesus in the Gospels. These do not say that God is a seed, or so small as a seed, but they nevertheless tie God and God's work to very small things, including, according to Mark 4, the smallest of all, the mustard seed. But that would be to cast the net broadly, and even if you cast the net that broadly, the results are pretty meager. Even so, despite the fact that textual divine smallness remains a minority report, one has to admit that it is there alongside textual divine bigness, which is, well, bigger, and by a lot. The opposite situation, however, obtains in the iconography. Divine bigness is not as extensively, nor as clearly attested in terms of artistic convention as divine smallness. Both things then, divine bigness and divine smallness, are found in both data sets, though in an inverse relation. Check it out. There's the art in the text. Divine bigness, some in art. Divine smallness, mostly. But the opposite in the text. Mostly and same. And wait for the animation because it's really cool. Boom. One more time. Come on, one more time. It took me hours last night to figure out how to do that. I'm going to do it 15 times. There's 13, 14, and 15. Now we can move on. As I intimated, divine smallness in art may simply be, and perhaps truly is, little more than a reflex or the result of the limitations of the artistic media, especially those items that have survived. It just might be that that's what survived. Small pieces, right? The others got destroyed or pillaged or whatever. There are, after all, at least some monumental images of deities, and there probably were more of the same at various points in time. But to underscore an important point once more, we often find that even in the monumental tableaus, the human figures, especially the monarchs, are portrayed as big or even bigger than the gods, right? Here it is one more time to demonstrate the point. Or then again, there's the fact that minor art, too, largely avoided disproportional presentation of divine and human figures in the same scene. So, if the small deity in text was a minority report, the opposite holds true for the iconographic record, the art. Big gods are much fewer and farther in between. This situation is little more than a lengthy rearticulation of Cale's conundrum. The cosmically impressive textual deity and the surprisingly small, even harmless depictions thereof. It's not unlike, in my judgment, the line spoken by the genie character played by Robin Williams, R.I.P., in Disney's animated movie, Aladdin. Phenomenal cosmic powers, itty-bitty living space. Right? I thought that was pretty funny, y'all. Work with me. Or you're finding good deals on sandals, perhaps, are going around. So, again, how is this disjuncture best accounted for and understood? Several ideas, I think, should be considered. One is that divine bigness, especially in text, and divine smallness, especially in art, are additional data in support of what Benjamin Sommer has called a model of divine fluidity. He argues that ancient notions of divine bodiness were fluid, such that a God in question could be manifested in more than one way and in more than one location, even simultaneously. So deities definitely had bodies in the ancient world, but their bodies were quite different than normal ones, a point that is, in one sense at least, fully expected, and a point that also holds true for God's body in the Old Testament, and also Christ's body as understood by many early Christian writers. Now, Sommer also argues that the fluidity model was rejected at certain key moments in the history of Israelite religion and theology, but in any event, in light of his work, the big God of the textual traditions and the small God of the iconographic traditions need not be seen as completely at odds. They are, instead, just different instantiations of a flexible or fluid divine body. By the same token, neither is one of these instances, big or small, text or art, somehow more true or accurate than the other. Instead, the divine body, form, or image is polymorphic and highly plastic. It can be big and small, diminutive and massive. This imagined plasticity permits the God in question to have a large temple or supersized throne, but also to be depicted in less than grandiose scale on wall reliefs or in truly pint-sized form on seals. The obvious question that arises at this point is if the text and image were really intended to convey the God's body truly or accurately at all. And even if they were, and we could somehow know that fact and to the correct extent, that both text and image were thought to do so in equivalent ways. This is a large and complex issue, right? Did they really mean to depict the God's body? And did they mean the text more accurately than the art, or the art more accurately than the text? To address it would involve a lot more time than I have here, treating a number of other matters that lie outside the scope of my lecture and my time. It must suffice to say here that the textual body is largely an imaginative product. It was probably mostly, if not entirely, received orally by people listening to the text being read out loud, because most people were illiterate, so they had to hear it being read. And then, upon hearing this text, subsequently imagining it. Any materiality to the textual body, say to a literate person who was actually able to read the text, would be limited to the specific words describing the divine body, connoting its size, appearance, attributes, and so forth. How those material words, whether letters on a page or signs on a tablet, are made into things is an entirely mental operation. The artistic body, on the other hand, especially given the tradition of figural representation of divine beings, not to mention low literacy rates, may well have been thought to communicate something that was somehow more material, if not also mimetic, about the deity in question, his or her nature, symbols, and so forth. This explains why some deities have certain artistic elements that others do not. It may also explain why not every piece of a deity's profile is found in the textual record, but shows up in the art, and also vice versa, or at least they don't show up equally. Whatever the case, the fact of the matter is that with the possible exception of a few literate people in the ancient world, the visual, far more than the textual, was the probable locus of religious attention and cognition. People who were religious in the ancient world were mostly religious through images, that is, not through text, because they couldn't read them. This underscores the importance of the small-sized God image given its sheer predominance in what survives. Now, the presumed elite production and transmission of textual traditions aside, one should not think that the small-sized God image, despite its ubiquity, was somehow the only or most common mental conception of ancient worshipers. Such an assessment would be inaccurate, not only to the big God textual tradition, which was likely widespread, but also because there were occasional monumental art pieces and architecture that we know existed. There can be little doubt then that ancient theologies held that gods were big, or at least that they could be big, and often were big. But the small god artistic tradition suggests that ancient theologies also held that the gods were small, or at least they could be, and often were small. And even if they weren't small, like essentially within their own self ontologically, at the very least they could be represented in very small ways. That last formulation is important, I think. So yes, the juxtaposition of the big and small tradition suggests a fluidity to the divine body, but it also suggests something else, namely that size in figured art is not presentational at all, but representational. Not mimetic exactly, not actually trying to imitate or capture the divine essence, but something else. There is something like the God in the image and something unlike the God in the artistic image, whether big or small. The unlike may have to do with the God's size, if the notion of divine bigness is or was deemed fundamental or more basic somehow. But that granted a default preference toward bigness needn't have been the case in light of divine fluidity. Ancient theologies may not have had a hierarchy of divine bigness over divine smallness. We might think, oh, of course gods are big, but we can depict God in small ways, right? Of course God's bigger than the Sistine Chapel, but let's just draw God up there anyway, right? But of course but ancient theologies, I'm saying, might not have had the same sort of hierarchy that God's bigness was always the dominant one and divine smallness was sort of secondary. In any event, this like and unlike of the image text problem vis-a-vis divine size can be compared, I think, to the way metaphors work. Thinking about metaphor, in turn, helps us understand the image text issue on the question of divine size. So let me mention 4 things that deserve consideration in this regard. The first is the matter of comparison, the like and unlike, or the is and the is notness that marks metaphors. Metaphors are like and unlike, is and is not, right? Famous one that used by the philosopher Max Black is, pardon the exclusive language, it's man is a wolf, or we could say humanity is a wolf. That's a metaphor, right? How is a human like a wolf? Well, the human is like a wolf, but also not like a wolf, right? Like and unlike, is and is not, are always operative in a metaphor, according to Black and others. So, speaking of how deities and temples are related in the ancient world, and this equation of like deities, like temples, Mark Smith has said that the crucial term in the presentation is the word like, which explains this point of similarity and difference, connection and disjunction. The word conveys the fundamental point that visible but inert buildings, temples, marked as temples, and mostly imperceptible but animate deities enjoyed little public life apart from one another on the extra-familial levels of social and political organization. That's a quote, and it's very dense. I apologize for it, but that's the way he rolls. Now, the same could be said for visible yet inert images marked as divine, and those unseen but seen artistically and active deities. These too shared a public life, but not solely in the level of extra-familial levels. They shared life that extended to the family level and even to less public and far more private arenas. The small-sized artistic items were, after all, personal objects, easily owned, carried, transferred, and passed on. In any event, this first point is simply that the small or big-sized God image is both like and unlike, both is and is not, the deity in question. This observation has ramifications for understanding how ancients understood and venerated these objects. Second point concerns the fuzziness of the metaphorical quality in question. I'm thinking here of Earl McCormick's theory of fuzziness, which plays precisely on the similarities and differences operated in metaphor, but which notes that the elements belonging to the different sets that go into considering a metaphor are themselves often imprecisely defined, so fuzzy. The fuzziness in the present case concerns size. What is size anyway? And what do we mean by it, especially when it's divine size? Summers' fluidity model is helpful, but perhaps in the case of size, the divine body is less fluid than it is just fuzzy. The big God with phenomenal powers can, after all, be confined to itty-bitty living space. Maybe divine size isn't ultimately a matter of big and or versus small, but something else. Size in ancient conception may not matter after all, or at least not matter in that way. The third point has to do with metaphorical awareness. Did ancient people know they were performing a metaphorical operation when they wrote of or depicted divine size? Did they know they were speaking or depicting their gods in some sort of metaphorical way, like and unlike, is and is not? Or were they completely primitive, right? And just that's really what they thought. They really thought that was Baal right there. Divine largeness in the textual tradition contrasted with divine smallness in the artistic tradition may suggest that in fact they did. They did know that they were, quote unquote, drawing a metaphor. No, therefore, this image is not the deity's actual size, just as it is not the deity's actual image. In this way, the material constraints of the objects fully granted, their small size, the small size of the object, the size aspect of the small God image is still metaphorical according to the very definition of the term. It's a transfer of or carrying over of one thing onto another. In this case, the God's body or form or image carried over into its material representation. The fourth and final point of connection to metaphor theory concerns the ways metaphors are ways we think, how they are matters of and a manner for cognition. I don't want to get into all of this about cognitive and conceptual metaphors, but people like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson have talked about this extensively. For instance, the way we think of time as money. So you spend time, right? And you save time. Or argument is like war. He demolished his argument. These are cognitive metaphors that shape the way we speak of these things. Argument doesn't have to be thought of as a war. It can be thought of as something else. Time doesn't have to be thought of as money. It can be thought of as something else. But we think of it this way, and our metaphors reflect that. I don't want to get into all that as macro metaphors, but instead I want to suggest rather that the small God image, along with its built-in metaphorical nature, can be a locus of cognitive attention. Okay? What I mean by that is this. It means that the small God image, and again, the status of so many of these objects as personal and treasured belongings, but also highly mobile and transferable, that must be constantly recalled. These small objects were a site where people thought about their gods. Okay? That's Baal right there on my seal impression, which I carry everywhere with me, just like I do my iPhone. Okay? Though they didn't have iPhones back then. But that was it. They had their little seals. That's Baal right there, they thought. And at the same time, by means of the metaphorical nature of the size issue, these small objects were a site where their thinking about their gods transcended the materiality of the image locus in question. That's a picture of Baal, not to scale. So, I think that's funny. That's Baal right there. No, that's just a picture of Baal, not to scale. That metaphorical operation, if right, separates the referent from the object. The divine God is not actually the object, which suggests again that ancients may well have known that they were speaking and making metaphors in their texts and art, even as it also and simultaneously allowed the object to become a focus for reverent attention. The image becomes an indexical sign at this moment. It points toward the reality, even though it isn't coterminous with it. But even though it wasn't coterminous with the reality, it still somehow points toward that reality and somehow participates in it, partly through depiction and presentation, partly through representation, partly through cognitive acts that are, in my judgment, both theological and metaphorical, sophisticated and profound. Far more sophisticated and profound than we typically think of ancient people who we often deem so much more primitive than us. So, in conclusion, let me return to where I started and try to connect a few dots. So first, with regard to the second commandment, we must say that it was often violated, or alternatively, perhaps we must say that it simply wasn't always enforced. Some might even say that it was not crafted, let alone enforced, until considerably later in Israelite history, and even then unevenly, such that some of the images we've explored this evening may not, in fact, have been considered violations at all of the second commandment. This means that the second commandment might need to be reconsidered. What is it about specifically, but more importantly, and the bigger question is, what is it ultimately about? Given later Jewish and Christian practices, it simply cannot be said that the second commandment, or at least its interpretation, applies to all aspects of figural art, and that at times that was extended even to portrayals of God's body that were deemed okay. So here's the famous Beit Alpha synagogue from the 6th century that has a zodiac in the mosaic floor of the synagogue. You'd think that would to break the commandment, right? With Helios, the sun god, in the middle. And here's Albert Dürer, Adoration of the Holy Trinity, 1511. There's God and the Christ, and there's the Spirit above, right? So, and that's just one of a million examples that we could illustrate. So, in light of that sort of thing, and these were religious people who certainly knew the second commandment. What is the second commandment about? I can't attempt a comprehensive answer right now, but it seems to me that in light of what I said tonight, the commandment may reflect worry, not only about other gods and their images, but about over-representation of divinity in general in figural art. But why would they worry about that? Perhaps because, to quote Wayne Booth, images have a way of colonizing the mind. And that's why when I say that, or I say this, you can immediately think of an image that you wish you could forget, right? But you can't, because that image has colonized your mind. It's in there, right? Images have that kind of power. But that is as true for literary images as it is of those in the plastic arts. Indeed, Booth's own work is all about figural language, not figural art. A literary image figured in the mind is just as liable to possible idolatry as any other, or so it seems to me. One wonders, for example, about the ubiquity and also the extreme failure of the dominant mental image of God that exists for so many people. You know, the old white guy in robes with white hair and beard. There he is in Durer's picture, right? That's what a lot of people think of when they think about a mental image for God. Look, I'm doing it 15 times again because I learned how to animate that. Overly specific and hardly definitive of the infinite God and hardly helpful, right? It's an idol by definition, or so it would seem to me. Be that as it may, let me come back to the title of the lecture and offer two final remarks that bring the ancient text image problem of God's body and its size to bear on the present day. At last. First and foremost, it seems to me that there is a close connection between what I've suggested about ancient images as representational loci of religious concern and devotion and what one finds in contemporary Orthodox iconographical practice. Contemporary Orthodox iconography may in turn be seen as additional, though much later, support for the idea that religious people do in fact relate to art in these sorts of theologically sophisticated and religiously devout ways. Of course they do. It's not therefore, to suggest they also did so in antiquity as well. Here's a few icons to illustrate this famous image of Christ from St. Catherine's Monastery, also 6th century. Look closely at Jesus' face. It's not symmetrical, right? This eye is not quite the same as that. Am I right? It's kind of creepy when you think about it. Obviously, his hands are doing different things. That's fine, but check it out. And what about his hair, right? It's a little really flowy over here. Cut a little trim over on this side. People have argued that, in fact, this is an intentionally two-sided image of the Christ, so you can actually mirror it electronically, and that's what you would get with... which in its own way is kind of creepy, isn't it? But nevertheless, let's look at it with the divine and human sides, or human and divine sides, kind of depends on who you ask, with Christ in more blessing and merciful form, and Christ in more severe form. In the more severe form, holding the gospel book, by the way, holding the book, but not just the Bible, the gospel book with the cross, and here with the sign of blessing. This is famous 6th century monastery, St. Catherine's in Egypt, of Christ. Here's a more recent, sorry, I went the wrong direction. No, I'm not. I'm going the wrong direction now. There we go. This is Andrei Rublev's The Trinity, maybe from about 1411. The Trinity, also called the Visitation of Abraham, because these are the three figures that came to see Abraham, who are figured as the Trinity in many Christian interpretations. Now, Moving from orthodoxy to Protestantism, particularly of the less mainline sort, I wonder if we might take some of these ideas that I presented tonight back to the Bible. On the one hand is the power of the image, or in this case, the icon and iconicity of the Bible. As Tim Beale has noted, however, it's somewhat worrisome that the most common image of the Bible is of a closed book. That image says something, doesn't it? Leave it closed, right? It's just fine closed. Anyway, that's what he talks about. Can my reflections, though, on divine size and metaphoricity be applied, perhaps analogically, to Holy Scripture? I think so. So here's my attempt in my last few minutes here, and we can have time for questions. Despite its weight and length, the Bible is, in the end, rather small, a finite corpus, especially when compared to the infinite God. It's the genius of Protestantism, according to Paul Tillich, though he said it wasn't exclusive just to Protestants, but it's the genius of Protestantism, according to Tillich, to not confuse the infinite God with any finite reality, including the Bible. And yet, despite the Bible's smallness, its finite nature, its itty-bitty living space, it too, no less than a small seal from Iron Age Palestine, can be, and often is, a locus of religious attention toward and devotional reflection upon the infinite God. Even if the book is small, that is, and the corpus closed, there remains therein nearly infinite potential for ingenious variation and inspiration. The trick, of course, is to use our icons, including our iconic scripture, in the right way, as a means to God the Father Almighty, but not confusing the two realities in a way that would ultimately bring us under the judgment of the second commandment. Thanks for your time and attention.